Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 6. I am so excited to get into this week's discussion. We actually are going to be kind of melding together the intersections of both race and gender this week, as last week, unfortunately, I was not able to meet my deadline of getting the mini lecture posted in a timely manner. I generally aim to ensure that they're posted by Monday evenings at the latest to ensure that you all have enough time to watch them and go through the other materials in preparation for your responses on Thursday and Friday. So please do forgive me or accept my sincerest apologies for missing that deadline. There was quite a bit going on. With that said, you all did a great job with reacting to the videos and to the reading for last week. And so I am super excited to kind of build on that and talk about the implications of racial disparities within the mental health care system. So, or kind of more broadly, not even within the system, but also as it pertains to the way that people make sense of mental health. So this week, we really want to focus on both of those racial and gendered kind of differences and disparities and try to think about what are the consequences of those disparities in our society, right? And also what is generating those inequities that exist. So first and foremost, when it comes to race, we know that there are racial variations in mental health, meaning that people experience mental health differently based on their racial background. And in fact, it can be a little bit difficult to actually measure mental health diagnoses among different racial groups because of the way that they may or may not conceive and conceptualize of mental health. So one of the things that we need to think about is how does a given culture or society impact people's experience of mental health symptoms? For instance, if somebody has symptoms of depression, exhaustion, fatigue, general sadness, will they call it depression, or will they potentially think that, like, internalize it and say, oh, I'm not strong enough, right? Or maybe they might think that they need a religious ceremony. Maybe there is a supernatural force, right, causing them to feel demented. And so it's really interesting to think about the way that certain behaviors, again, become constructed as mental illnesses, and then the way that different cultures and societies make sense of that. And it's really important to understand the implications of that and the histories behind it, specifically within a context where we have had extreme racial inequality. And so there has been oftentimes a distrust of medical professionals, particularly by people of color, who have often been disenfranchised, alienated, and marginalized, and really even mistreated by the medical system. So another thing that we want to think about is how do labels get applied to different groups? And how do those labels get applied in ways that may further disenfranchise minority group members? And so this can also impact people's willingness to identify with having a mental illness, the stigma. But does that stigma at all differ or become more intense if you belong to a racial minority group? I've used the example in the past of the oppositional defiance disorder. And so it's really important to kind of critically evaluate, can these labels actually lead to further inequality, rather than the inverse of what we are hoping, right, is with a diagnosis, there is a solution and improvement in overall health. And so it's also really interesting, again, to consider the context, right? And so this means that we want to look at the intersections of race, class, and gender, and think about how do those categories really influence people's lived experiences, right? Living through a series of racial kind of microaggressions, for instance, say in a workplace. If somebody starts showing up to work and, say, experiencing signs of depression, the sociological question is to, of course, acknowledge that that person may be experiencing depression, but is it truly and only something that is stemming from the individual? In this case, we really want to be critical of the environmental institutional context, which is mediating those symptoms. And then we want to kind of like broaden that to think about that on a societal level, right? And this is, I think, an incredibly important topic. Thinking about the gender disparities and differences in mental health, and then considering the racial disparities in mental health and access to quality health care. And then lastly, another really interesting line of inquiry this week that we want to think about is how certain behaviors become pathologized. And so on one end, it can be dangerous to pathologize behaviors that could otherwise just be considered regular. And even by a given culture, right? We can look at, for instance, American conceptualizations of certain disorders in other cultures who may not necessarily subscribe to those diagnoses. And so in one way, it could be, well, people don't experience this and we're not going to have like a self-fulfilling prophecy by kind of believing in mental illness, right? But the other issue is do we end up normalizing pathological or problematic symptoms, right? And so we kind of have to find the balance between not wanting to necessarily construct individuals as ill and pathologizing whole groups of people as deviant or incapable or incompetent, which sometimes mental illnesses unfortunately have historically been used to relegate a group as inferior based on their mental status. However, we also don't want to overlook very real symptoms and impacts on mental health, cortisol levels, right? Stress, anxiety, panic attacks, PTSD, which is very likely to be experienced by individuals who have lived through not only individual but cultural trauma. And this, in fact, is what my research looks at. I am examining the trauma that is experienced by youth living in inner cities that are constantly policed, and also the bigger prison industrial complex. So how does having a 1 in 3 chance of ending up in prison end up overall impacting young Black men's mental health, for instance, might be a really interesting research question. This week, I really want to wrap up soon now with having you think about what is the domino effect, right? Is there a domino effect when it comes to mental health, other kinds of inequalities, and namely being like financial crises, gender disparities? So like when we start to think about all of the various inequalities that are existing in our world, in our society, what we want to do is say, like, how are these things possibly linked, right? And so if somebody, for instance, loses their job, how might that impact their mental health? And then how might their mental health impact finding another job? Or how might losing the job impact losing a home, and how will that impact mental health? And then how can that, following like that kind of, that series of events, right? And it can unfortunately become a very harmful feedback loop. And so I'd like to end with saying, what do you think could be systemic interventions when we start to think about these kind of really structural issues of racism, classism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, xenophobia, which is the fear or discrimination of people who are foreign, right? We have all of these kind of stacked inequalities. And so if we want to see improvement in mental health, of course, we want to ensure people have access to quality mental health care, which can still be considered an upstream approach, but arguably can be considered a downstream approach if we're thinking upstream is, how about we eradicate the social conditions that are generating these mental health symptoms in the first place? Would people of color, for instance, have the same levels of depression, anxiety, PTSD if they didn't have a history of slavery, right? Or legalized segregation, or present day practices and policies that reproduce racial inequalities in their lives? And as we go through the course, we're going to be wrapping up soon, we can continue to think about this question beyond just race, class, and gender, right? We can think about sexual orientation, we can think about age, size, skin color. And what we really want to do is take this intersectional approach to understand how various social categories essentially mediate one's experience with mental health, not only the way they make sense of it, but again, the treatment that they may or may not receive, and the way that it's broadly defined and stigmatized in society. So really looking forward to your responses this week. As always, if you have questions or need to check in, please feel free to send me an email, and I can be available for office hours, text messages, whatever works best for all of you. I'm hoping that you're staying well. We are nearing the end of our semester, and please be on the lookout for the paper prompt. Sometime this week or by the beginning of next week, the final paper prompt will be posted, and then you are free to post it by the time that it is due or any time before then. And yeah, be well, do take care of yourselves, and I'm very excited to be moving into week 6. Bye.